It's a real privilege to be asked to speak on this occasion. As has been said, I was part of his team, and for me, he was always a mentor. In a way, it's because of his encouragement that I applied to join the government of India, come back from where I was in the World Bank, and I've never regretted that decision. And it gave me an opportunity to do exactly what I had been trained to do, and it was a lot of fun. Of course, you know, he was the person who said that there is a vacancy in the Ministry of Finance, so why don't you apply? And so I applied and I got in. But within 6 months of my coming in, he was moved to the Planning Commission. So I didn't get the opportunity to work with him then in the Finance Ministry, and pretty much for the next 10 years. I mean, we were close. I knew him, his family, he and his wife were very kind to me and my wife, and very often treated us as part of the family. So we got to know him personally. But I never worked with him for the first 10 years. And then when he became finance minister, he brought me into the finance ministry after a few months, and then I got to work directly with him. And later on, of course, when he became prime minister, I was then in an assignment in the IMF, and when I called to congratulate him, I said, it's great that, you know, Mrs. Gandhi has announced you're going to be prime minister. We wish you all the best. He said, well, I'm going to need a lot of help, so why don't you come back? And I said, sure. And within a very short time, I was back. So it was a real privilege for the next 10 years that I was in the UPA government as deputy chairman of the Planning Commission, worked under him and very closely, and had a first-hand look at how government functions. Now, you know, one of the advantages I thought of speaking at the end is that I would get a sense of what others have said, so I can just pick up little bits and pieces. So I do want to say that one of the very important things that everyone has said actually is that the reason he is held in so much esteem is not because he was a great economist, he was a good economist, etc., but because he was a very unusual personality. And that has been brought out by many people. He was not exaggerating what he did. He was very receptive. He was very sensitive. You know, I always like to think that he taught me that India is a very complex society and also a very complex economy. You know, he was very fond of saying something which one of his teachers in Cambridge, I think, had told him, that everything they say about India is true, but the opposite is also true. So, you know, analyzing what to do if you're dealing with such a complex situation makes you realize that things are not easy. And most of the time, you may agree on the problem, but how you solve the problem is very complex. And I think that requires a lot of consideration. It requires a lot of listening to people. It requires also recognition that even though you think this is the right thing to do, there may be many reasons why that won't work totally. So you want to know. And I think he exemplified that. And those of us who worked under him were very aware that you could go to him and say that, you know, this policy which you have announced, I mean, sounds very good, but I have this reservation, or I'm not sure about it, or it will have this other effect. And he never made you feel that you were somehow being disloyal or disobedient or something, because you always would be able to see the other side of an argument. And it's very important in a complex, both in a complex country and in a situation which is complex, that somehow whoever is running the government has to deal with this problem. And I thought he brought that really to a fine art. I'll give you a few examples. And I think reference was made, Sachinji mentioned how he felt as a junior colleague in the cabinet, the sense of being part of a team. You know, when he first did the economic reforms under Prime Minister Narasimha Rao, we all knew that the country was in a crisis. I mean, I frequently give lectures nowadays in universities, and I ask the audience, how many of you are over the age of 30? And usually one or two hands go up. So then I say that most of you were not born when the economic reforms began. So therefore, you have no idea what a mess it was. And you have no idea how bad the economic policies that we were running were. So let me tell you, I mean, sort of get rid of your prejudices and listen in the beginning to appreciate the importance of what happened. I'm not going to go into all that now, so rest assured. But I do think, I am pleased that, you know, younger people today somehow know that 1991 was very important. They may not know the details, but they know that economic reforms began then. And you know, on that occasion, I mean, basically, the government was undoing what had been done previously over many, many years. I don't think he was the first person who thought that you need to do it. Actually, his predecessor, as not as finance minister, but as Prime Minister, Mr. Rajiv Gandhi, for whom I worked for a while, I mean, he had said in Parliament, you know, after he talked about we must get India ready for the 21st century, which was a nice and an important image, at least for young, you know, I was then about 41 or something, and looked like a good thing, get India ready for the 21st century. And what Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi said in February of 1985 in Parliament was, how can we be competitive if we are working with systems that are 20 years out of date? You know, I have always regarded that as a very important statement because everybody knew we were not competitive. I mean, whenever the growth rate isn't good or exports aren't good, the general feeling was that policies are not being properly implemented. I think it was Rajiv Gandhi who said the system is dysfunctional, but he wasn't able to change the system. Now, you can go into, you know, he was a young person, many other things happened, Bofors, etc. He was not actually able to bring about systemic reform, but he recognized the need for it. And you know, at that time, China also recognized the need for systemic reforms. They, of course, had political continuity, so they were actually able to get it done. Of course, they're also a completely different system. So I don't think we can learn very much by looking at China. But in our case, in 1991, there was an opportunity because the country was in a complete mess. And I think the team of Prime Minister Narasimha Rao and Manmohan Singh managed to bring about very basic change. And you know, Dr. Singh told me, and I've said this in my book, so I'm not revealing anything I haven't revealed earlier. I mean, he said that, you know, when Prime Minister called him and said, look, it's a mess, you better be finance minister and so on. Dr. Manmohan Singh told the Prime Minister that, look, we'll have to make big changes and it will be politically difficult. I mean, your own party may not actually appreciate what needs to be done. And, you know, in no party are people ready to change unless they are really convinced they need to. And what Dr. Rao said, Mr. Rao said to him was, look, you do what you think you have to and I will take care of the politics. And then he added, this was very important, by the way, because if the Prime Minister had not backed him, that would be the end of the reforms. But what he also said, Mr. Narasimha Rao, that if you succeed, we will share the credit. If you fail, you will be blamed. And I think that's also that's a correct political decision. You know, appropriate deniability, he accepted that. And he told me he thought it was very fair. Now, he himself, as finance minister, called a bunch of secretaries. I was then commerce secretary. A few months later, he brought me into the finance ministry. And he called a whole bunch of us and said, look, we, that is the government, are going to make big changes. These changes will go against what you've been taught are the right things to do. And I need your help. If you don't help and you just try to sort of scuttle it from the back, it will be very difficult. So I'm requesting you, please help. I know we are making big changes. The Prime Minister is aware of it. We need your help. And he then went on to say, look, some of you may have some reservations because you genuinely don't believe that all this liberalization is a good thing. I mean, you know, he was himself aware of the fact that you could take different views. So then he said that if that is a problem, please tell me now and I will make sure that you get a better job. But please don't just sit there and be obstructive. And I was one of the group of fellows as we all walked out. I could sense that the secretaries were very, very flattered. Because, they were not being told that I have talked to the Prime Minister, this is what you have to do, now go and do it. That's the implementation approach. They were actually being told that, look, it's very complex. Sometimes there'll be unexpected problems. I expect you to come back and tell me that, listen, this is happening. But please join the effort and be part of the team. And they were really, really pleased. In fact, many of them said this is the first time this had ever happened. Maybe it has happened since, I don't know. But the idea of when you make big changes, you have to have a team, and the people in the team have to be part of it. And I thought that was really quite a remarkable thing. Two other examples I want to give. One is Sachin himself has said that the Indo-US nuclear deal, which was started in 2005 and finished in around 2008 or so, very difficult. And initially what had happened was we had a reasonable relationship with the United States, and then of course during Mr. Narasimha Rao's period, the government had decided that they were going to develop a nuclear weapon. In fact, that decision was first taken by Rajiv Gandhi, and he gave the go-ahead that, look, because he knew that Pakistan had one, so we had to have one too. And then during Mr. Narasimha Rao's period, it was ready. But then it turned out that the American satellites spotted all the activity going on in Pokhran, and we had not really recovered from the crisis. So nobody wanted to irritate the US too much. But later on, when Mr. Vajpayee came, he himself, by the way, he was the one who exploded the weapon, gave the order. But he gave the credit to Narasimha Rao because he said that when I took over, Prime Minister Narasimha Rao had told me that sab kuch taiyar hai, ab kar lijiye. And then, of course, he exploded the nuclear weapon. And then it was very difficult because everybody, the Europeans, the Americans, the British, they were very upset. And quite a lot of effort was made by the Vajpayee government to normalize things. Jaswant Singh did a lot of work with the Americans. But all that they were able to do was to get things back to where they were before the nuclear explosion. In other words, all the sanctions were removed. But the restrictions on us, which the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty imposed, was still there. That basically meant that, okay, we removed the sanction, the exports, we can go on, but as far as nuclear is concerned, you're still out. And Manmohan Singh used to regard that, as he himself described, as a kind of nuclear apartheid. In other words, everybody is partitioned. Those who have nuclear weapons are allowed to do all kinds of trade. At one stage, there was a view that the Americans are just doing this because they want to sell us nuclear power stations. And we are doing this in order to let them sell the power stations. This is actually totally false. I mean, I happen to be part of the team who actually support the government. And that's why the government didn't fall. I mean, otherwise it was a done deal. I mean, once the left walked out, end of UPA. But Indian politics worked in a way in which the Samajwadi Party, which is totally against the Congress otherwise, actually stepped in and saved the government. So it's, for me, a very interesting example that, maneuvering in politics requires a lot of complex activity. And I think those who very often said that Manmohan Singh is obviously a great economist, but he's not much of a... I mean, this one incident should establish that that is actually false. And by the way, a lot of what we have now seen happening later on, including the military exchange of technology and so on with the United States, etc., would not have been possible if the Indo-US nuclear deal had not gone through. Because that was the first impediment that was removed, and others had to be removed, and then slowly more and more and more cooperation took place. Now, given what's happening in the world and geopolitics, this is clearly, I mean, I'm not an expert on this, but you all read in the newspapers.
That why don't you pull the government, why don't you pull out on inflation? Because the inflation was very high at that time, about 10%. So no, this is imperialist thing, and we are...
Okay. No, actually, a formal acknowledgement by someone from the left that this was a historic blunder would be the greatest tribute that can be paid to Dr. Manmohan Singh's memory. I'm sure that there are some people who recognize that, but everybody's got their political compulsions, so you don't expect too much. Anyway, I don't want to. I'll just give one other example. I'm just trying to give examples because somebody said, Pankaj said that he would like people when faced with a difficult situation. Correct. But while we have to grow, all growth is not the same. It's got to be a growth where everybody benefits, not necessarily equally, but significantly. It's got to be a growth which is regionally balanced. I mean, India can have 8% growth. If only the South grows at 10%, it doesn't matter what happens to UP and Bihar. That is not going to work. So you've got to get it regionally balanced. How do you do that? That requires a lot of complex thinking. I think he was also very concerned that, different social groups, scheduled castes, minorities, OBCs. I mean, we're a complex country, as many people say. So everybody's got to have a sense that not just for those guys, but I'm also getting some share of it. And finally, he was very concerned that the environment cannot be neglected. In fact, that change was reflected in the 11th and the 12th plan, which, the foreword of which he wrote as chairman, and I wrote a preface or something as deputy chairman. The 11th plan said towards faster and more inclusive growth. So that inclusive was all of this: inequality, poverty, gender, regional, and so on. In the 12th plan, the title was faster, more inclusive and sustainable growth. And the sustainable was really the environmental thing. So this is sort of documenting the complexity of the objectives. The idea that Manmohan Singh was just interested in liberalizing the economy doesn't do justice to the fact that he had a much broader vision. It is true, of course, that as finance minister, the dominant thing he had to do was to liberalize, but believe me, the system was so ridiculously controlled that I don't think you had to think very much. Had we done twice as much as we did, we would still not have done enough. So my only point here is that while his contribution in liberalizing the economy was very important, that was not the only thing that his message on economics was not just liberalize, liberalize, liberalize. It was a much more balanced approach. Well, thank you for inviting me.